Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, which is called The Critical Hour, that one call that can prevent a recordable injury outcome. In case we haven't met before, my name is Holly Foxworth and I'm a registered nurse and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications here at Axiom. And I have the pleasure of being your host today. In terms of what we're going to cover, what we're going to look at is really going to focus on that first hour. So we refer to that as the critical hour, but it's the first hour right after an injury occurs. And because that's what determines many times whether a case can remain manageable at the first aid level or whether you're going to see that escalated to something like a recordable outcome or lost time outcome, something along those lines. So we're really going to look at what this gives you in terms of an advantage and how not using or reporting injuries within that first hour puts you at a disadvantage. So we're going to unpack kind of where some of those delays happen, what that looks like, why these types tend to cost you as an employer more than some of the additional cases whenever they're not called in that hour, and then also how it is that you can prevent those recordable outcomes. So as we go through the content today, I really would challenge you to kind of think to yourself, if an injury were to happen today, am I protected or am I potentially exposed? And when I say me, I'm referring to your organization and what you have in terms of policies there. So we'll get started on that shortly. We do have a fantastic panel that's joining us today. We have Dr. Cherry, who is our Chief Medical Officer. We have Dara Wheeler, which is our Chief Marketing Officer and EVP of Product. We also have Cathy Tran, which is one of our account managers, along with, and I hope that she's been able to join, Elise Mikkel, who is joining from Sherwin-Williams, which they are a paint and distribution organization, if you're not familiar with their brand, but they're actually one of our partners, and they have graciously agreed to join us today and kind of share some of the best practices that they've implemented within their own organization and the results that they've gotten by doing so. So before I kick it over to the presenters to introduce themselves, just several quick announcements. They're on the top right-hand side of your screen. You should see a red box that's there. And by clicking on that, that enters you not only for next month's webinar, but also for the whole entire quarter. So that could give you up to 3 hours of continuing education. You just click on that button, it'll automatically get you registered and send you a calendar invite. And there's nothing else that you would need to fill out in terms of additional information. But our webinar this next month is called Zero Heat Cases, the Prevention Secrets that Top Employers Use. We're going to be hosting that on May 14th at 1:00 p.m. Central. And we're actually going to have the team from Epicor that's going to be joining us for that one. And they have actually partnered with Chevron and were successfully able to eliminate all heat injury cases whenever they were working together. So you guys, I know that sounds kind of like a dream, but it is possible. You can eliminate all of your heat-related injuries and illnesses that occur with the right equipment and with the right processes, and they'll definitely be able to talk through that with us. We are offering continuing education credits, as I had mentioned. Today would be one hour, and to be eligible to receive that continuing education credit, all you would need to do is remain with us for the remainder of the hour, and then at the very end of the presentation you should see a survey that will come up. So once you complete that, you'll be able to download your certificate and you'll be set up. So we will have this available on demand in the event that you missed anything or that you want to share it with any of your colleagues so that they can earn credit as well. But one thing I will tell you is that I love for you guys to participate. I'm already seeing so many of your comments. I love all the hellos. That is the place that you want to be for these events, because that is the place that I go to give out thank you gifts at the end. So for those that engage with us the most, ask some great questions, etc., I always go in and after the events, and I like send some thank you notes afterwards, some love notes we call them, and some gifts. So if you're interested in some swag, that's definitely how it is that you'll get access to that. And then two final things. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see additional resources, but also I wanted to bring to your attention the box that's there that shows you our new Facebook community, which is called the Axiom Signal. And so we rolled this out at our summit. It started there and it's starting to grow. So I would encourage you to join that so that you can engage with your fellow colleagues, other people within the industry. You can hear about what's going on within their organizations. You can post if you're having a challenge yourself. You may want to post something and ask the community, their take or how they're addressing that type of issue within their own organization. So the first person from today's chat that joins the Facebook group and posts something in there, we have a new North Face backpack that we'll be sending your way. And so definitely there's some incentive to get out there. Lastly, I'll mention that we do also have some free passes for NSC Spring that's going to be coming up. That is I believe it's the first week of May, and it's going to be held in Baltimore. So if you are interested and you're not already registered, you're welcome to drop your name there in the chat, and we'll make for sure that you guys have a pass and get access to the expo for the full time. So at this point, let's go ahead and bring in our group. Dr. Sherry, we'll start with you and then move over to Dara, followed by Kathy. Dr. Sherry?
Thank you, Holly. Hi, my name is Scott Cherry. I'm Axiom Medical's Chief Medical Officer. My professional background is I'm board certified in preventive medicine, public health, and occupational environmental medicine. And I've been supporting the government, industrial operations for the past 15 years. And it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, Dara?
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dara Wheeler. I'm Axiom's Chief Marketing and Product Officer. This is my 20th year. I had to look at the date. 20th year at Axiom, and I'm really happy to be here and supporting our clients in this conversation. And I'll kick it over to Kathy.
Thanks, Dara. Hi, everyone. I'm Cathy Tran, one of the major account managers here at Axiom Medical, based out in Houston. Been at Axiom for over 5 years now, or close to 5 years, but 16 years in the health medical consulting and project management industry. Happy to be here.
Awesome. And it looks like Elise may still be having some issues getting connected, but Elise is the regional agency manager for Sherman-Williams. And so she'll be joining us shortly, hopefully, within the chat. And so she'll be able to participate. But what's unique about this event today is that they are willing to share some of the results that they've had within their own organization. So I'm definitely interested in hearing what some of their best practices are, some tips and tricks, and I'm sure that you guys will walk away with some of those as well. So let's go ahead and get started. And Dr. Sherry and Dara, I'll come to you first and just kind of ask you here, what seems to be driving outcomes that you're seeing for injury?
I think something that's been so apparent to me over my 8 years at Axiom is that we have really strong data that shows how early reporting dramatically improves the outcome of the case, regardless of the actual injury or mechanism, or the mechanism of injury or the diagnosis or severity of injury. And this has been compelling data for at least the 8 years I've been here. And Dara, has that been the case for you over the 20 years?
That's very consistent in 6 years of business at the company. This has been something that we consistently see year over year, that the faster injuries get reported, the better the outcome. And I think we've had various theories on reasons, and I know we'll go through that, but this is something that at first glance sometimes feels counterintuitive, in the fact that the more injuries get reported early, sometimes our partners, and I think Sherwin-Williams is one of them, find that they have safer cultures, and we can dig into what that means. But what ends up happening is you get a really big shift in an environment if you encourage early reporting, and that becomes a KPI instead of no injuries. And I know we can dig into what that looks like.
Yeah, definitely. So Dara, where would you see what do you think is causing that gap to occur between some that are reported early and some that are reported late?
I think there's a host of reasons. I think that, when we think about injuries, And I think a lot about employees and their willingness to report. A lot of that is driven by process and culture in terms of if employees are encouraged to report early versus I think of the old image of the sign in the warehouse that says, 0 days since last reported injury or 10 days since last reported injury. When you think about having that sign up there, raising your hand and being that employee to change the sign down to back to 0 is a really interesting thought process, because most employees are not going to want to be the one to drop a record down to 0. So often there's a reluctance to report. There's stigma around reporting, even minor things. One component of this that we see over and over again is thinking about injury on this spectrum of there's the minor, injury, and then there's these major and more serious catastrophic injuries. And although the minor injuries seem so small, sometimes those are the ones that can cost the most. And I know Dr. Cherry has some ways of thinking about this, but when you think about the fact that a small paper cut might need to be managed differently if the employee is diabetic or has an underlying medical history that might cause it to be more serious versus something that's obviously more catastrophic or serious. And so the balance of reporting becomes something that becomes challenging, because it's who assesses that. And if you're at a company trying to manage these programs, and we partner a lot with safety, health, HR, risk. And even as a safety person, if you have a history of being an EMT or a nurse, which we know a lot of safety professionals do, the fact that you're assessing on behalf of your company is a challenge sometimes, because employees see that as like, well, why does the company need to know my medical history? Why do I need to tell them that I have diabetes? But it makes a big difference in the path forward if we know things like they're diabetic. So I'll pause and let Dr. Cherry jump in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we look at our data, it's pretty compelling that if it's reported timely, so I would say our target really is within 1 hour, but we can think of it as even within 8 hours, that, the claim duration is much shorter and the first aid resolution rate is quite high, around 75 to 78%. If a claim isn't reported until an incident isn't reported until after 24 hours, the claim duration actually goes about 20% longer, and the first aid resolution reduces dramatically down to close to 60%. And if we think about this for a second through first principles, usually minor injuries would be the ones that you might think, oh, I can watch and wait before I call Axiom or I engage the process. And the more severe injuries would be the ones that needed to be called in sooner. But our data tells us something different. The cases that actually are delayed actually have worse outcomes. And so there can be a couple of things. It can be that safety culture that Dara was talking about, where you have maybe a lack of psychological safety, where employees feel reticent to come forward with an injury at first. And so they're waiting longer, and then that incident ends up festering and becoming more severe. And it really does delay the outcomes. And so, to me, this has been a very interesting phenomenon that I've seen, at least for the last 8 years.
Yeah, definitely. Cathy, I'll come to you next and just kind of ask you about what you're seeing in terms of reporting culture, and specifically maybe at Sherwin-Williams, if you want to speak to that directly.
Yeah. So this is where our story gets to starts to get interesting. So when we look at the data for Sherwin, majority of the injuries are being reported within the first hour, because we see it by the median. So at the same time, though, the average reporting is still well over 24 hours at 26. But that gap tells us something really important. It tells us that the system isn't broken. The teams know what to do, and in many cases, they are doing it well. And I won't spoil what their outcomes are by reporting within the critical hour just yet. But what we notice is the challenge is based on the smaller subset of cases when communication breaks down. So those delays are what starts to drive outcomes in that negative direction that Dr. Cherry was just talking about. What we consistently see, especially in large and distributed operations like Sherwin-Williams and others that we work with, is that the breakdown doesn't usually happen in the moment of the injury. It's typically in the minutes after. Just what exactly Dr. Cherry was saying is when people are now deciding, who aren't necessarily medical professionals, making a decision on what to do, who owns the situation, and how to respond. So that's where hesitation or uncertainty or too many handoffs start to cause delay, where the team member is not getting that immediate care and attention. So interestingly, with Sherwin, when we break it down even further and we're able to specifically identify that starting at hour 4, that's when we start to lose control of the situation and see a major decline in first aid outcomes.
Yeah. Dr. Sherry, I'll come to you next, but just kind of asking, what does that look like? If most are moving quickly, kind of the question becomes, what happens with the delayed few that are there? What happens if you delay that reporting?
Right. So it can be a bunch of biological things, or it can be some psychosocial things. So if we look at the biological aspects of an injury, the sooner you can get assistance and start applying first aid measures, it can dramatically slow down the inflammatory aspect of that injury. And we know that then the pain is reduced, the swelling's reduced, and return to work and return to, full function is much sooner. And then, so obviously the converse applies. If you wait to seek care, that inflammation can keep going. If you're doing the same type of activities that are inflaming or causing more injury, it can just kind of spiral out of control. There's also a psychosocial aspect of it, to where once an injury kind of has taken root after, say, 24 hours, there can be a change in the psychology of the injured employee, where they actually are it's called catastrophizing, but in the sense that, oh, I'm really injured, so this is going to be a long journey for me to recover. If you haven't sought care by then, too, you can have family members suggesting you go to potentially the emergency room, which you might get more care than you need. And so it can just make things kind of spiral out of control. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword, where you have the biological factors as well as the psychosocial factors that can impact this incident.
Absolutely. And I liked one of the comments that it came in from Daniel. Had mentioned that muscle tweaks and soft injuries are often a factor as well. The workers, the worker may just think and work through it, thinking that it's a small amount of pain, and then find out later that pain is a lot worse. Dara, have you seen that a lot? And do you feel like that's a fair assessment, that many of these that are delayed, that kind of go sideways when they don't have to be, that those are some of those soft tissue injuries?
Yeah, I like what Dr. Cherry said in terms of there's the biological component, there's also the psychological and social component too, and we continue to see that if we get in front of an injured employee, regardless of the injury type, and I think that's really important. I think they're saying, oh, Kane was telling me my mic wasn't working, but I think you guys can hear me okay?
I can hear you, yes.
But yeah, I think soft tissue is interesting because often there's the pain associated with an injury, but maybe not something that is diagnosable in terms of no broken bone or, things like that. And if you can get in front of the biological component first in terms of the inflammation, like Dr. Cherry said, then you can often reduce things like swelling and pain very quickly. But it is also that psychosocial component when, if you think about it, just I've had employees tell me, we had a safety and a team that discussed something like this. And if you think about your drivers out in the middle of nowhere, your employees that don't necessarily come in, they may be field employees. When they get injured, even if it is a relatively minor injury, there's a lot of negativity that comes into your own brain about that injury because you're worried that you might not be able to work. You're worried about all of these things that happen. And it can happen in such a split second. So if you're a truck driver in the middle of nowhere, you step wrong, maybe a mild ankle sprain, you start having all of these worries because can you drive? Can you do these things? And we had a safety supervisor tell us that the thing that helped him the most when that happened was that the nurse on the other end of the line said, "You're going to be okay." And just hearing that he was going to be okay alleviated the issues, like Dr. Cherry said, around catastrophizing. There was no anxiety continuing to be spun unbounded of, well, now I've got an ankle sprain. Well, now I can't drive my truck. Well, now I can't support my family. Well, now, it can spiral so quickly. And so if you talk to somebody who's a calming professional on the other end of the line who says, hey, guess what? We're in this together and you're going to be okay. Then that alone is a part of a treatment plan, because if you think about it, that just settles the whole scenario into we've got you, we're going to come up with the next steps. Let's work on this together. You're not going to be, your job's not at risk. We're going to be okay. So I really like just that voice on the other end of the line, talking to somebody and settling the scenario with, hey, we got this. We're going to be okay.
Yeah, Dara, I'd just like to add a little bit more to that. As we look at this more in depth, some of these landmark studies are really showing the psychosocial state surrounding an incident may even be more impactful than the actual type of injury they've experienced. And if you actually think through it, if there's not a good safety process in place that just takes over as soon as an incident occurs, if we allow the employee to kind of come up with their own kind of internal calibration of when they should report, what happens really is they're going to work through pain until they hit a certain threshold. And again, they're not medical professionals. So once they've decided to report it based on this delayed reporting approach, they've already decided in their mind, my incident now is so impactful that it's going to be a big deal. And so I think it sets into place this kind of construct in their mind that they have now a serious injury. So just the way I see it from my bird's eye view is, if you can engage into the process as soon as possible, it informs with professional insights into what's going on with them and even what to expect, so that dramatically changes the psychology of how someone thinks about their injury in the dark, so to speak.
I agree completely. And along with that, I saw a comment that had caught my attention from Emily that mentioned this had happened to me. The employee didn't think that they were hurt, and then his mom told him he needed to go to a specialist. I'm sure that all of you have found yourself in that position at one time or another, where you may have an employee that had a minor injury and they think they're fine, and maybe that happens on a Friday, and all of a sudden then you come in on Monday morning and you've got lost time on your hands because they decided over the weekend that, hey, this pain is getting worse, and I've got to do something immediately. And what happens? They take themselves to the ER or whatever it may be, and then it becomes that disaster. You really lose control of what that outcome can be because you weren't included in the very beginning. You didn't have an advocate for you that was able to kind of give you some recommendations and go through that closely with the employee so that they feel like they're definitely taken care of. So I appreciate you adding that, Emily. Moving on, and Cathy, I'll open this up to you as well. And I don't know if Elise is able to join yet, but what is the opposite side of that? What happens when they do report it within that critical hour?
Mm-hmm. So Elise, can you hear us yet? I wasn't sure. I see you popped on there. Okay, I'll go ahead and show off, but at least for Elise's Sherwin group, so they're on the CTS fleet side as well as distribution and warehouse. So you can see there when they report their injuries within 60 minutes, 81% first aid outcome. And Axiom's benchmark is 74% with all clients combined. So they're well ahead of the curve there with that critical hour reporting. And we're able to show, again, by hour 4, their first aid rates start to drop. And that's based on all the calls that are coming into Axiom and that we're reviewing internally and with their team to determine what is causing some of those delays. But really, though, I want to highlight the first 60 minutes. That's where the timing directly impacts your outcome. Those first few minutes, we call it the critical hour, but really, if you can do it sooner, that's where we can shift the pathway. So we can't, the only thing that hasn't changed is that the injury itself occurred. So what can we do moving forward to help mitigate some of the potential outcomes? So what Dr. Cherry just talked about earlier, the missed early guidance, delayed communication, a clinic visit, or maybe after hours ER care, those soft, I love that we're bringing up MSDs, those soft tissue sprains and strains, because obviously at hour 0, 1, it's not that bad, but like I tell the team when we start training, we're not young anymore. That sprain and strain is not going to go away the next day. It's going to escalate and get and worsen over time. So what we have emphasized with Sherwin and their team, and the message they tell their team members is, why would you want to take that injury home? Why is this something that you want to burden your loved ones? You're taking this into your personal time now. So it's better to get it taken care of within work hours, so we can make sure and monitor you and confirm that you're okay before you leave the job site or you clock out. So one of the most effective ways to address this is, can you remove the decision making from the team member and the immediate supervisors, the frontline team there? Are you allowing them to call immediately without question and hesitation? There's no, let's wait and see how you feel. It's immediately without hesitation. And I see Alpha Laval is on here. They are one of the incredible teams that has bypassed frontline management entirely. No questions asked. If you think you're not feeling well, there's a minor injury, even if it's a paper cut or a splinter, you're calling in immediately. One of the stories that I know Elise shared the other day was, how many times have we gotten paper cuts, right? It's so simple, but this particular employee had a laceration and was exposed to metal shavings. They cleaned it out, but obviously there's still remnants of the material within the finger. And they thought they cleaned it well, but in 3 days there was infection and swelling, and it resulted in an amputation just from a paper cut because they thought it wasn't a big deal. So instead of asking, what should we do? We already know the answer, right? So that alone can significantly reduce escalation.
I wanted to provide a little bit of perspective too. Both of these numbers, the Sherwin number is absolutely exceptional at 81% first aid. So that means just under 20% are, medical treatment beyond first aid. And the Axiom benchmark is really class leading at 74%. When organizations don't have a formal process, when we consult with potential new clients and they don't have anything formalized, you'll actually see the inverse applied. So about 75% will be medical treatment beyond first aid, and 25 to 30% will be first aid. So having a process like ours really does move the needle with regard to getting the right treatment for the right type of injury. And again, these are just really amazing statistics, the Axiom benchmark as well as Sherwin's.
I agree, Sherwin, 81%, that's fantastic. It's just a phenomenal result that they're being able to receive there. Dara, I was going to go back to you. There was a question that came in from Missy, and you had brought up culture before and the impact that culture has. And what she had mentioned was, she said they found delays in reporting due to HR receiving the KPI reporting and responding negatively because the employee had already had maybe a prior injury reported. And so it said that this has instilled a culture of fear of corrective action from HR or too many reported incidents, even though they've already, maybe it was a small one. Do you see that frequently? Do you feel like that's where things tend to go wrong in culture-wise, is when there's corrective action, punitive penalties that come along with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things. When you think about incentives and you think about both positive and kind of negative incentives around injury reporting, what you tend to see, you see kind of two sides of this. You see the kind of punitive side, like Missy's describing, where somebody might be written up or disciplined for having multiple injuries, or feel like they are going to lose a job, or be written up for that. On the flip side, you see a lot of organizations that have cultures where they incentivize low injury rates. And so there's two, and when we say incentivize, I mean, for those of you that have never experienced this, like actual bonuses tied to either low or no injuries. And so what ends up happening in both of these scenarios is employees either inadvertently or advertently get the message that reporting is not okay. And so what you see happen is when you have a delay there of reporting, the small things don't stay small. And so when you have an opportunity to be in front of a small injury, the paper cuts of the world, like we're using as an example, or Kathy's example of the metal shaving, if you can't get an opportunity to get in front of those quickly, those small injuries can often become the most expensive and costly, timely, or most expensive from time, cost, all of the things, because you can't really manage the whole process. And I know there's been a lot of history around managing it from the injury. And when we talk about injury, we often are so focused on physical components of injury. But what we forget, and Axiom has often felt like, when we say culture, it feels so wishy-washy to say culture, because culture feels like something that we all kind of know what it is, but it's hard to define. And I think what we're finding is that these sections of impact between culture, psychology, and biology become so important, because the way we incentivize behavior is to really think about how we incentivize the behaviors we want, and any unintended consequences of those incentives. And so what we tend to see is organizations that are either thinking in a punitive way, or are encouraging things like that seem like something positive, like let's just really give everybody bonuses for no injuries. What ends up happening is the unintended consequence of everybody feeling like they can't raise their hand and say they got hurt. And so what we find is organizations that embrace this approach, that even if it is the wishy-washy culture approach, they actually start seeing a really positive net benefit of safer environments, because employees start to call out near misses, opportunities for improvement, and everybody gets bought into that positive cycle instead of the negative cycle that we can see.
I agree completely, Dara. But what you mentioned, and I think it was maybe Callie that had a client that they had showed the difference by the time that they had changed their reporting process, or their culture there. It previously had been, like you had mentioned, of being bonus based on the number of injuries and trying to keep that down. But once they flipped that and they started tying the bonuses to early reporting or near misses, then they completely changed the whole trajectory of what their outcomes were with those events.
Yeah, I think they actually flipped it. I think they're one of the safest organizations out there. And that feels daunting. This is a large organization, very regionally driven, lots of different stakeholders. And I think the message has always been, if you can start small. This is one area that seems so small, but is so outsized in impact. And so if you think about, like Dr. Cherry always says in his discussions, it's like, if you think about the takeaway, it is this is the takeaway, that if you can get injuries reported timely and build that kind of muscle memory in the business and in the organization, then it becomes a very positive, very, very strong impact over a very short period of time, actually.
Yes, definitely. Mr. Lopez had a comment that I liked. He said, we require that all injuries be reported, and then the on-call nurse evaluates the employee by phone, FaceTime, or in person, depending on the injury. And once they've been assessed, then they treat them with first aid measures. So they refer them to a clinic for further evaluation treatment. I like that. That's similar to the process that we promote as well. Dara or Dr. Cherry, I'll come back to you and just kind of ask the question of, is there a difference, not just promoting ourselves, that's not what we're here for. We're here more for guiding you in the right direction. But is there a difference between what we would recommend versus just a nurse triage?
I'll take that and let Dr. Cherry jump in. Again, to Holly's point, we're not trying, whether you use Axiom or not, I think it's just it's an important question because there is some differentiators. And I think it goes back to incentives as well. So when you work with a third party, make sure you understand their process, how they manage injuries, and what downstream components get maybe incentivized for those injury management processes. So making sure that they're independent, making sure that they're driving towards best practice outcomes is critical. And we see triage as very different in that triage, if you think about either emergency room triage or even telephonic injury triage processes, it's typically a one-time assessment to understand. Typically, it's a clinic decision, yes or no. So typically, it's an assessment very much driven by pain scale and a very kind of rudimentary assessment to understand, does this employee need to get a further evaluation done at a clinic or an emergency room? And if so, let's get them in. If not, here's some first aid recommendations. The more robust early injury intervention and care tends to be a lot more beyond that kind of process. And you really need to dig into kind of incentives around who's managing the injury and what the downstream financial components of that are. And I'll just kind of pause there and let Dr. Cherry weigh in on that.
Yeah, just to further what you've said, Dara, is, it's the depth of the service and expertise. And yes, usually a triage service is a one-time assessment. And it actually reminds me of when we engage the emergency room, where we're always telling the doc or the provider that, look, we can provide additional follow-up, but most of the time, absent that, an ER doc, when they see a patient, an injured employee, they're thinking, I'm never going to see this person again. So they're much more skewed to over-treatment to make sure they don't miss anything. One of the biggest strengths I've seen at Axiom over my 8 years here is our ability to follow up timely and at any moment. We can follow up every 15 minutes, every hour, every day, off hours. And so that really is a force multiplier when it comes to unmanaged risk. Again, if something is not part of the process, it's really unsure what's unfolding, right? And so I think triage is probably better than nothing, but it's just a one-time snapshot, and it's heavily guarded to clinical referrals. I think when we've partnered with new clients that have had more of a triage service, it's closer to, it's a much lower first aid rate because, again, the service is limited.
Yeah. Many times those are associated with claims as well. You may see that some of the insurance providers, they may say to you that they have a free triage or whatever it may be, but a lot of times those are associated with a claim gets opened immediately. So our position on that is definitely to address that much more, take a upstream approach so that you can avoid the claim before that ever occurs, if that happens. We did have one question that came in, Dr. Cherry, that Debbie was asking, and it was in regards to how do you address the issues when an employee comes to you, they start working for you, and they all of a sudden have an injury, and you find out that they had a prior history of injuries, such as a back injury, something like that. What kind of a difference does that make, Dr. Cherry? And how can you mitigate?
I think that's actually probably the more common scenario, whether our audience or organizations realize it or not. People will have a fairly complicated past medical history. So, pre-existing injuries do make you more susceptible to future injuries. It also changes the treatment course for that injury. So this is actually good information. And again, it's probably more common than it isn't, where someone doesn't have some type of, physical injuries, or even some of their comorbid medical diagnoses like diabetes, et cetera. So, that definitely fits into our assessment as well. And, it can complicate the matter in the sense that, an injury may manifest differently than what you would have expected if you didn't have that insight. But I would argue that's what's happening anyway in your populations when you see a case that doesn't make sense at first glance.
Yes, completely. Cathy, I'll come to you next and just kind of talk to me about, tell me about what you were seeing in terms of what happens or what those outcomes look like when that process is delayed.
Holly, I think Elise might be able to join as well.
Oh, is Elise here now? Elise, are you here?
I'm testing. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Fantastic. We're so glad that you could join. Yes, definitely. Well, we'll come to you then, Elise, and ask you kind of what you see when reporting is delayed there at your organization.
So I actually had a case today that I was just talking through with the team on a delayed report. The employee felt a strain while they were operating a roll-up door and continued to feel discomfort in that area for about 2 weeks. It was a lower discomfort. They were given first aid instructions, but they weren't noticing any difference. So by the time this 2 week or so mark came around, they wanted to go to a clinic, which we set up for them. And as it turns out, they were given some prescription medication that would have done the same thing, that if they had followed the original first aid measures, which would have been Advil, Aleve, just to help with that discomfort and inflammation, then they wouldn't have needed the prescription strength one. So it makes all the difference for when we start initially with the first aid response, as well as being able to help minimize the time that they are feeling that discomfort with the intensity that they're feeling it.
Thank you, Elise. I agree completely. There was a comment or a question that came in and that was talking about wouldn't the severity of the injury potentially impact that first hour reporting stats? And in more severe cases, it's treat first and report later. Dr. Sherry, how would you address that? How would you handle a case like that?
Can you repeat that last part again, Holly? I missed that last part.
You bet. So the question was, if the injuries are potentially more significant, they're more severe, how is that going to impact first hour reporting stats? And then also for those more severe cases, are they treated first? Do you treat first and then report later, or how should that work ideally?
Right. So ideally, we view any type of injury at any severity should be called in as soon as possible. I think the example Elise gives us is a really good one, where we see this many times, where the outcome of a clinic visit is very similar to what we would provide under first aid. However, it's under kind of prescriptive rules. So it goes medical treatment beyond first aid, where there's really no clinical outcome that's not superior than to what over-the-counter treatments would be. And so this could be a mix of the psychosocial aspect, where the person's waited 2 weeks, and so they've hit that threshold of I have a severe injury, so I need to see a doc at a clinic and get a prescription. Whereas if you get early engagement, that really can help a lot with regard to the biological aspect. So when slips, trips, and falls are the most common causes of injuries. And then we have sprains and strains, which are the typical things that are the most common things that are happening. And so an inflammation cascade will be kicked off whenever you pull something. And if you can treat it very quickly with really just like ice and over-the-counter medications, that dramatically reduces this inflammation cascade. You can think of like a nuclear reactor just kind of going out of control. That's kind of how our immune system is kind of going off with inflammation. If you continue to do those type of activities, it just kind of grows on itself. So early reporting is really critical across whether it's a severe injury or a minor injury.
Thank you, Dr. Cherry. And that brings us to talk about some of the different outcomes where you can see you might have the same injury, but you have a different outcome. And I love the story of the heat injury that we had two employees from the exact same company, and they both had a heat injury, one called Axiom. They had a first aid outcome because we mentioned and shared first aid measures for rehydration, things like that. The other went to an emergency room, and they were having the exact same symptoms. The one that went to the emergency room ended up having significant diagnostics that had occurred. They did a full workup, including a cardiac workup. It was significant, and with a significant price tag. And so the resolution wasn't different, but the outcome was definitely different. So, Kathy, what are you guys seeing in terms of what that looks like for timing and the different outcomes that you'll see there at Sherwood?
So I want to make sure I was on. And Elise, are you still there with us?
I'm still here.
Perfect. So what high performing organizations do a little bit differently because of the timing. And then John, I do see that you asked about, remote workforces, and this is perfect because that is Elise's specialty and wheelhouse. And Elise, tell me again, how many employees do you have working nationwide that are remote?
So we have just over 1,200 drivers in our fleet across the country. So all in different time zones, and they're all driving in different areas.
Mm-hmm. And so what is your best recommendation for them? How do you provide that best practice guidance for them to reach out to Axiom and to self-report and build that reporting culture?
It takes intention. So we have different ways of getting the teams together. We set up calls, we use Teams, we set up actual phone call meetings with them. We'll schedule in-person meetings with them, but we get the message out. We also use different programs so we can send them like a text message that they can read, or their tablet can read to them with a reminder of anything that we want to share with them. So we find that if we start just reaching out, put a bunch of posters out there, put a bunch of stuff on the TV screens showing, hey, these are the things that we want you to know. Get the information out there. They're going to wonder what it is. They're going to scoff at it, look away, but then they're going to keep seeing it. So they're going to start to ask, okay, what is this thing? So just getting it in front of them, whatever way that we can get it in front of them is going to start it. And then once they start engaging and asking us those questions, we can give them examples. Okay, so when you roll up the landing gear, you're using just one arm, right? Well, what if your arm is sore? Have you thought about trying to use your other arm? And then once it gets to the point where they're saying, hey, no, this hurts. We need to do something. Can we look at it? Are we looking at the PMs? Are we teaching them how to stretch? Are we getting them that information? But showing them by asking all those questions that we actually care. We want them to know that we want their engagement. We want them to let us know what's going on in their world, because we don't see them all day. So their world is a world away. It's kind of cut off. So we got to make sure we find the ways to help bring them back and show them that we are interested in what's going on in their life, and that sometimes those things that they don't think about, they played baseball with their grandkids over the weekend. That's the important thing. Okay, well, that's extra work that you don't normally do, so you're probably going to feel it for a little bit more during the week. So here's some things that can help you get through that.
Thank you, Elise. Dara, where do you feel like that first hour kind of breaks down? Where are the common pitfalls that you see where things kind of go south?
Yeah, and I want to comment on something Elise just said. I love the concept of what you were saying about engaging with those remote employees or employees that might not be in a centralized location or have access. And I think it sounds like the way that you and the team are managing that is amazing, because I actually think in the research, Dr. Cherry and I have been looking at those isolated employees are probably the ones that need more of this engagement, not less, because they're isolated. And if you don't get in front of that, then these are the employees that are at the most risk of other kind of issues around the isolation and then the process. And so even just having something to support them through this process is in and of itself kind of the treatment plan in a lot of ways, in that making sure that they know those resources and engaging with them in those conversations is really a really powerful tool to help make sure they feel engaged overall to the organization. So I love that, and I love that idea. So where it breaks down a lot, we see, I mean, we've talked a lot about incentives and ways of aligning incentives, but thinking about like the wait until tomorrow, it's not that big of a deal. The minor injury, just, hey, we're going to shake it off and go back to work. And it really is dependent upon your employee population, age demographics and experience. And you see this in various industries where some of the employees that have been around for a while just want to get back to work. They don't want to report. And so you've got kind of that culture, but then you've got maybe some in newer status that might get injured more often because they're newer and less used to the work that they're doing. And so making sure that everybody knows, no matter how experienced they are, no matter how little or much they've worked at the company, that this is part of what we need to do because of all the why behind it, that we have invested in you, we've invested in this process, and this is why we're doing it. And I think most of you in safety, HR, any of these roles know that if you give employees the why, usually it helps a lot to break down some of these first hour breakdowns. Uncertainty, handoffs, I mean, these are all really great points, but I think it all just comes down to education, exactly like Elise said, making sure everybody knows who to call, when to call, why they call, and reinforcing it time and time again.
Thank you. Dr. You brought up something earlier whenever you were talking about how important it is that they get the right care and what those outcomes look like. What does that make a difference? Why does that make a difference?
Yes, so, again, the most common injuries are usually sprains and strains. So what happens is our muscles, our connective tissue with regard to ligaments and tendons, they're going to be stretched beyond kind of their normal elasticity. And so what happens is there's inflammation that starts at that point. So our immune system is going to kind of analyze that area and spin up a lot of different white blood cells to just check out, is there an infection? Is it just a kind of a non-infectious inflammation from this overstretch? But what happens is there's a lot of swelling that happens. It gets very warm and it's trying to protect that area. So it's making that motion more painful. And as time goes on, this cascades where more cells beget more cells, and it really becomes quite a very interesting biochemical process. And so if as soon as an injury is, an incident occurs, if treatment can begin then, it really slows down that cascade, where the longer you wait, the more time you and treatment you need to actually undo what's happened. And so I kind of think of it as like an unchecked nuclear reactor that just keeps going. Whereas if you can just shut it down early on, you don't have this kind of, massive overreaction, so to speak. And so we like to think of the right treatment at the right time, because the right treatment too late is not the right treatment. It's going to need a lot more care, usually medical treatment beyond first aid, et cetera. And so, Holly, you actually had brought up the heat stress case studies that we've had. And I think that's the perfect example where our process allows really quite frequent contact to make sure there's progress with a heat stress injury. Whereas even in a clinic, it's usually just a one-time assessment. So usually medications like an IV are going to be ordered, or, restricted work, et cetera. Whereas like someone with real heat stress symptoms showing up to an emergency room, the ER doc's going to work them up for like a heart attack, make sure that they're not potentially having a heart attack. So you can really see the excess care being given if it's at the wrong place. So, really early what's the saying? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This is truly, I know it sounds cliche, but it truly does apply to this case, to these types of scenarios.
Elise, I'll ask you the question that I'm sure everyone else is kind of wondering whenever they saw your amazing first aid report, your stats there. But what is it that your organization is doing a little bit differently that has been able to give you those types of results?
So we have a version of cardinal rules, right? And one of those rules is reporting all incidents. And incidents includes injury, illness, accident, property damage, first aid, near miss. And that's the important one, that near miss, right? So you would really get in trouble for not reporting that you bumped your elbow as you were walking down the hallway versus reporting it. And then, well, why were you even in that area? That was probably a bad example, but so the important thing is that we communicate that. We want to know when something happens. If you get a paper cut, if you get a splinter, it's those small things we want to know so we can help make sure that we get you the care that you need and it doesn't happen to anybody else. Can we investigate it? Can we change the process? Do we need to look at anything else around that to make sure that it doesn't happen to anybody else and that it doesn't happen to that person again?
Completely agree. And what would you say that you do differently in terms of process that makes sure that nothing falls through the cracks? What are you doing differently there?
Well, we're all human, and we understand that. So we know that we need processes to help make sure that we can go back and verify things. So we keep track of anything that gets reported. So reporting an incident is not just the employee having an incident and letting somebody know. It is also on the back end of the paperwork. But the paperwork doesn't have to happen right up front. We do need to log it somewhere so we can go back and review, okay, did we follow all of the steps in our process for when an incident happens? And have we followed up with the employee to make sure that they're still okay? Have we then gone and done the investigation? Have we made the change? Have we verified that the change worked? And then do we need to continue following up on that change? Is it something that it just works, or is it something that if somebody new comes to the company and doesn't understand why we're doing this and then tries to change it, that we can let them know, hey, this is why we put this in place? It's follow-up before, during, and after that helps make that difference.
I like that. And are your policies, are they site specific, or do you have or does everyone within your organization follow the same safety processes?
So like you can see on the slide, it's one site, one rule. We have a lot of different sites that do a lot of different activities. We have manufacturing sites of different calibers. We have distribution centers. We have the stores. And then we also have the fleets. We have drivers for the stores as well. So there's all kinds of different activities. So ultimately, we have the same set of rules. And then just within each division, there's going to be different pieces that fall into it. Not everybody is going to be operating a semi-truck, so they're not going to have to follow these exact same processes. Not everybody is manufacturing paintbrushes, so they're going to have to do some things that are a little bit different. But ultimately, we come back to that same process, right? So we're investigating, we make a change, and then we check to make sure that change worked. So every site is going to do things a little bit differently, but we have our EHS standards that every site has to meet. There's just a little bit different cadence for the different sites.
Before we look at the results that you guys had, there was a question that had came up specifically for you, and they had asked, how many people do you have that are helping you manage that program?
The program, so within my division, we've got 10 physical locations, I guess 9 physical locations, and then our headquarters where our national team is out of. So at each of those locations, we have a safety specialist tied to just the fleet. And then we have the distribution centers. So there's also a person, usually a team, an EHS manager, and then also a specialist that are focused on the DSC. So the specialist that is focused on the fleet, there's 10 of those. And then all of the fleets they're divided a little differently in size. I would say like our biggest site, largest number of drivers would be in Midwest USA versus out in California, while we have a smaller distribution center there, so they only have 60 drivers versus 300 drivers. So the number of safety personnel depends on the number of drivers that site is supporting.
Makes total sense. Cathy, I'll come to you last as we wrap this up here, but what out of the slide jumps out at you the most that you would want other people to know about?
Is that we're always focusing on these main metrics right here, regardless of what client is with us. This is what drives performance. We always look at critical hour, what's causing delay, what's causing success, identifying, again, everything that they're doing well. So we even break this down on a more granular level, but then most importantly, taking what's within the hour and within greater than 24 hours where that breakdown is to show exactly why critical hour is so important. So if there's three things that we want to take away from today that Sherwin is already doing is, number one, identify those delayed cases. What are they? They might be those sprains and strains. Like, how much is that costing you? How much is that claim ending up compared to calling and contacting Axiom from the get-go? Where what are the additional impacts of those delayed cases besides work comp claims? And then secondly is defining clear ownership, like Elise just mentioned. She's at the regional level. Below her, we have the localized site leadership. And of course, we have C-suite and national leadership that supports the program itself. But as much as ambiguity that can be removed, that is a great way to identify swiftly what the process is. And then third, finally, eliminating the wait and see. We don't want the wait and see because we don't want anyone to go home in worsen condition than what they came in with. So if you can act early and consistently, we find that you see the same results as what Sherwin is experiencing. So small, but immediate impact the next day.
Small but immediate. I like it. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it, Elise, and thank you for joining. We appreciate you and your willingness to share what's going on at your organization as well. Cathy, you as their account manager, and we look forward to seeing you next month at the Zero Heat Cases. So thank you for joining. Bye-bye.